So we started this process back in 2009. So just to give you an overview and tell you where we're at now. I put this notice for this meeting on Facebook, and there were some comments from people on Facebook, saying, why don't we address real problems, sea level rise, oh come on, that type of thing. So if you're one of those people, this is not the meeting for you, because we've had this argument 10 years ago, and we're past all that. We have now come to the conclusion that climate change is occurring, sea level rise is real, and it's a real problem that we're going to be addressing. So that's where we're at today. So all of the discussion that we're having today is not debating whether that issue is coming or not, or if that issue is real, or even how real. The issues that we're going to be debating tonight are how are we going to address the impacts of climate change, and what are we going to do about our community and how we're going to make our community resilient. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. Okay. So we did our first sea level rise study back in 2009. This was finished in 2010, and this was done by a planning and zoning comprehensive planning advisory board at the time. Dr. Fergus was on it. Raise your hand. He was on that. We also had Dr. Ken Lindeman from FIT was also on our planning and advisory board, and they kind of helped us through that process and created a subcommittee, and we created this first blush analysis of the impacts of sea level rise on our community, and this was the results of that study. So this was kind of like very preliminary, using a very simple bathtub model of how sea level rise would affect our community. So this is the basically the worst case scenario of sea level rise at 6 feet over the mean high water line. Okay. Oops, I'm going back, sorry. Do you guys know about Sally Beach? So it's funny because I used this presentation at Florida Defense Alliance, and that's basically presenting to the military community on what we've done for our city for sea level rise, because they were looking at very similar vulnerability studies for their installations. So it's definitely a common thing that if any owners of any major infrastructure, major facilities that are very costly, could be damaged by any risk, it's sea level rise and climate change analyses are just part of the typical risk assessments that people do now. So this is kind of where we've been. We started with the resilience, the Climate Ready Estuaries Project, which was basically that graph I showed you, or that map I showed you before. We went on to start looking at our comprehensive plan, and we adopted a adaptation action area in our comprehensive plan for the ocean front, basically addressing erosion. And we left open, okay, now we're going to look at other areas. So then we went and partnered with the East Central Florida Regional Planning Council and went after a Florida Department of Environmental Protection Coastal Partnership Community Resiliency Grant in 2014-15. And that grant was really the start of when we started engaging the public in this issue. And so we had our first public workshop in this very room in 2014. This is what the area here in the Schechter Center looked like the day before. And that was when the river backed up into the outfall right there, which floods Jackson. So whenever you see Jackson and Wilson and all that flood, that's why. It's because the river rises over the outfall. And Jason, or Dr. Evans, is going to go over some of that with you when he talks. This is the next study that we did. Well, this is that study, and then these are the curve rates that we use. And this is like, I mean, even though I'm a city planner, this stuff is well beyond me, so they're going to talk better about that. And these are some of the projections and how they impact our city. This is in 2040. This is in 2070. And this is in 2100. So these are the issues that we're facing, and this is just sea level rise. This is not hazard analyses or anything like that. This isn't when a storm hits or anything like that. This is just sea level rise. This is storm surge, and these are the models that we use to come up with what are the major storm surge impacts. And storm surge is probably the most noticeable, erosion is the most noticeable impact of climate change in our community right now, okay? So most people see that when you go out to the beach after a hurricane, is the erosion. These are our flood zones right now. I'm just going to skip through this. But this is the hazardous modeling that Dr. Evans is going to speak to you about. And right now the city is adopting, or basically redoing our stormwater master plan to address some of our pipe issues. So that's another thing that we have to look at, is when we're looking at our lifespan of our pipe, that is affected by saltwater intrusion and things like that, and we have to consider that. Do we start looking at a shorter lifespan for our pipes due to the rising water table, pressure on the pipes, and then also saltwater intrusion? Here's some of our city facilities that are currently at risk with this flooding issue. So that's some of the things we're talking about now. We purchased property already to start moving some facilities. And then also sustainability. And you'll hear a lot about our sustainability. I think one of our board members is walking out right now. He's like, I've heard all this.
I'll be back. I'm here to certify me. Never staying on, I promise. I've got someone manning the camera. I'll be back. Double book.
He's going to a Surfrider meeting about sustainability. So that's one of the things our city is very proactive about is sustainability. So we're actually at this next council meeting, council will be approving the contract to put solar on City Hall, and we'll be the second city, and I think the Central Florida area, right, to put solar on a municipal building. Right? Second city? Winter Park? No, I'm sorry, third city, because Orlando's got 3 facilities. And that's it. So, with that, I'd like for you all to take a moment to, since you got kind of an introduction, a first blush, and do your Mentimeter exercise, right? Tara, you want to come in?
So 6 people so far who responded to me, pull up the screen somewhere.
That should be one. Yeah.
Just real quick. Okay, so far, this is the word cloud that you guys are creating. So if you have not looked yet, go on there. One of the things that's really interesting is sustainability, because there's always the conversation as what is sustainability, what is resiliency. Can't be resilient without being sustainable, so it's good to see that you guys all feel the same way. And then if you hit next on your slide, on your phone, you'll get this screen. So that's where you would want to ask whatever questions. You can ask as many questions as you want. It'll just keep going. So next is Dr. Evans and Crystal Goodison.
See if I can figure out how to work this thing here. That's advances.
Go down.
Okay, down advances. Great. Thank you so much, guys. And so, I've got some slides here that I'm just going to really kind of go through just very, very quickly because they kind of hit some of the things you've already hit at there, Courtney. So. I've got the long history here. Really, Satellite Beach throughout the state of Florida is really looked upon as one of the leaders in this planning. I know working with City of New Smyrna Beach, we're getting ready to start with them. They're just really getting started, and what woke them up there was Hurricane Irma, and they got hit really badly, and they now understand that they want to plan for rising seas. You guys here should just kind of applaud yourselves for all this work that you've done. And of course, yes, the sea is rising. We're already convinced of that. Yes, we think it's accelerating. What makes the planning hard, I always use this slide to just talk about how really complex this is that if you go to NOAA reports and dig in, that to be very, very conservative in how we think about this, that we're very confident the sea is going to rise by at least 8 inches and at least, or all the way up to 6.6 feet by 2100. We're pretty sure it'll be more than 8 inches, but of course what to do, right, in terms of planning. It becomes a very difficult conversation. I often get asked, how much is the sea going to rise? And I'm not sure. There's a lot of different things in terms of thinking of carbon emissions, all sorts of kind of decisions we make. But in terms of planning, I always say it's kind of the wrong question. It's really, what is your risk tolerance? And so that's really the very important thing to think about. So if you're building a garden shed, I always say, you might not care about sea level rise. If it floods, who cares? You're not going to elevate your garden shed up 8 feet off the ground. It doesn't make any sense. But a nuclear power plant, to go all the way on the other side of it, you're very risk intolerant. And so you want to plan for that in maybe very, very improbable scenarios and for long periods of time. So what's easy about Satellite Beach, what's nice is you've already had that conversation. And so it's actually in your comp plan and you have the language. And so in terms of planning, we already have, okay, this is what we're going to look at in terms of infrastructure, right? So we're looking at, and there's already adaptation action areas that you set aside, already some really good work. And these maps, they're going to look, the information all starts to look the same. And there's themes, basically kind of South Patrick Drive. We'll see it's going to be an issue. And it's more or less the western side of the island is where we're kind of looking at flooding issues. On the east side, it's really erosion. So for this project, so what we were doing is trying to go that next step. So we've gone through all of the planning, kind of the hard discussions about sea level rise, that's very important. But then once you accept that it's happening, you start planning, then it gets into the nitty gritty. Understanding your infrastructure, trying to make decisions and actually implement and actually spend money on projects. And so we're going to talk about HAZUS, and I'm going to actually hand over here to Crystal Goodison. This is a FEMA model that is used for hazard planning. It is a finicky beast, and we're going to talk about that some. It's also very useful. And then using HAZUS and using all of this GIS data, then how does that get into very specific things in terms of policy? And also, again, learning from stakeholders. Students have worked on this project. There's a lot of learning that goes on with this. A lot of this work is really, really groundbreaking in the sense that, again, really for a community being this far along, you're one of the only ones in the country that's really this far along. So really kind of leadership there is extremely important. So stormwater. So it started kind of going in maps, going out in the field, and working with Dr. Fergus, working with folks like Alan Potter, and there's an island in the back. I'm going to show a picture of island. So when we talk about sea level rise stormwater, right, this might be hard to see, but stormwater drainage is the thing that starts to go first. Why is that? Well, let me show this next slide here. That in areas that were built back in the 50s, the way we used to do stormwater is we would just put a pipe in and go out right in the estuary, right? After 1975 or so, the Clean Water Act, we stopped doing that, but a lot of areas have this. And then when these pipes were built originally, the sea was a little bit lower, and when it would rain and the water could flow freely. As the sea rises up, you start getting things like oysters in the pipes, you start getting more saltwater intrusion in the pipe, not necessarily coming out where anyone can see it, but people start to notice things like oysters. They also notice that when we used to have that rainfall, it would drain. Now it's not draining as fast as it used to. Why is that? And it's because of this issue here. Then we get extreme situations like Miami, and what you're talking about as well here, that where when the sea gets up even high enough, it comes out the wrong way. And so that's when people usually freak out, and that's usually when communities start planning, is when it's not raining today and there's water coming out of the storm drain. Why is that? And it's salty. And so there's 2,000 outfalls. So if we think about the Indian River Lagoon, and this is a map I got here from Tara, all the way up here from Volusia County, all the way down to Martin County, this is a regional issue. When we kind of look at this, like, wow, there's a lot of this planning that needs to happen. And there's also water quality issues as well. So we know about the lagoon. Having those pipes going straight out is not good either for water quality, but just in terms of flooding, it's going to be a huge issue. Here are just some numbers, kind of Army Corps sea level rise. This is what we used. This makes some sense. I'm not going to go through this too much detail. So here's what this is what we came up with, right? So this is the stormwater inventory base, right? This is where Island in the back worked for months, taking survey data. What was great about Satellite Beach, which is unlike a lot of other communities, is that your public works people are pack rats, and so they kept all of the old as-built and surveys and maps. All that stuff is there. It's wonderful, because a lot of communities throw that stuff out. And then, what does that mean? Then that means you gotta pay surveyors to go and recreate all of that information. What we were able to do is take it all, and patch it all together. Right, so Island, she spent about a year actually working on this, I think. And it's a wonderful, and so we've got lots of information, lots of data. We've got elevations for most of the infalls, the inferred elevations, and so it's a modern, up-to-date stormwater GIS. We're going to hand that over to Nick. We have it done.
Thank you.
What that allows us to do, and so why this is important, is that when you know how low the stormwater pipes are, then you can very easily calculate where is the water, where is it actually going. So where it's red is showing that just mean water level, this is average water level from the west side here, is actually going to penetrate into the storm pipes. Right, so that means you would look down, and unless there's something blocking the water, that there's going to be salt water within these pumps. When it rains, it can still drain out, but it makes it slower. And what happens over time is, of course, with sea level rise, no secret, that it starts to move, right? And so now they're red, so this is actually going to 2040. And really, Cassia is one of the hot spots. And other areas, again, South Patrick Drive is where it's really, we see a lot of the issues with stormwater. And of course, it makes perfect sense because that's where everything is low. And so we could probably go out right now, we could look in drains and we'd see water, right? And then if we go up to 2070, right, we look, again, it's just pushing further and further. What this says is that in terms of stormwater planning, this is going to be a constant issue of trying to keep up with it, just for flooding. I mean, not even thinking about water quality, which of course, when it's going to change, and with the thinking about the lagoon and all the issues with the lagoon, that there's opportunities to fix things to make it to where it's also going to reduce the impact. I know that you guys are leaders in that as well, but what this says here is that this is long term. This is long-term, a lot of infrastructure that needs to be updated. It's going to take a lot of creative engineering, and it's going to be a lot of work. I mean, that's what this says here. And what you might note is there's some areas over here that we didn't actually have the invert elevations. These were not in any thing that we could find. So talking with Bert, most of these are basically just one pipe with maybe one infall that goes out to one outfall, a bunch of the streets over in this area. And apparently there haven't been a lot of flooding issues there yet, but what's likely to happen is that once it starts to happen, it's going to start happening along all of those. So this is kind of future work to kind of get out there and kind of survey some of this. But yeah, the main area is right along this east side, all along South Patrick Drive. So now I'm going to turn over to Crystal Goodison here, who's going to talk about the HAZUS results. And here you go, Crystal.
Thanks, Jason. I'm Crystal Goodison. I'm the Associate Director for the University of Florida GeoPlan Center. That is a GIS, Geographic Information Systems Mapping Center in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. And we were brought on to this project as a partner to help with the HAZUS modeling. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the objectives of that. But the former director of our center, Dr. Paul Zwick, is a HAZUS trained professional, and he's just been a whiz at HAZUS. So we thought we could bring him in to help us look at some of these issues. So really our objective was objective 2 from the overall project, which is to try to use HAZUS to do some coastal storm surge modeling. And what HAZUS is, it is a GIS-based software that was developed by FEMA, and what it lets you do is estimate potential losses from natural disasters like hurricanes, floods, and earthquakes. And so it's primarily used for hazard mitigation and recovery, but you can also do some mitigation with some assessment with it as well. Couple of things the software lets you do is, one, estimate what the physical damages to certain facilities and infrastructure are going to be from a particular hazard event, and then it allows you to calculate economic loss in your community, business interruptions, and repair costs. So, a couple of our specific modeling objectives were, one, first to model coastal storm surge and model future storm surge under sea level rise conditions. And then also on top of that, from those future storm surge events, figure out what the economic impacts were going to be under those future storm surge events. And we were going to focus on impacts to buildings, economic impacts to buildings from flooding. So one of the great things about HAZUS is that it allows you to do these damage assessments using all this information within HAZUS. And the typical way that they do their damage assessments is by census block. They basically have an inventory of all these different building types, what their values are, and it allows you to pick a disaster and then figure out what the impacts are going to be within these census block areas. If you're a whiz at HAZUS, like Dr. Paul Zwick is, and he trained Adam Carr, one of our graduating students this semester, trained him how to break into the software and go down to the parcel level. So not just looking at impacts for a course area like a census block, but let's drill down and see if we can figure out at the parcel level what the economic impacts would be. And then finally, where we have information, building footprints. So looking at what the impacts from a storm surge would be for at the building footprint level. So what we wanted to do is try to get really refined information to give to the city to say, under future sea level rise conditions and storm surge, future storm surge, these are going to be the economic impacts moving into the future. And our hypothesis here was that if we use better data, more refined data, we're going to get better results, and we'll be able to give the city some more refined information so that when they move forward and make adaptation decisions that are financial in nature, that they'll be able to make more targeted financial investments for the city. So quickly, our methods, I'll try not to go too deep into the methods, but basically what we did is we modeled a 100-year storm event. We added sea level rise to that. We added a couple different scenarios of sea level rise. We calculated what the building impacts would be under each of those sea level rise scenarios. We looked at that at the census block level, parcels, and footprints, building footprints for where we had some footprint coverage. And then we compared the results to say, okay, one, how does storm surge change with sea level rise increments added to it? And two, are we really getting more refined information when we use this better data, when we use parcels and footprints? Are we really able to get a better economic assessment from that? So I'm going to show you some results. And I have to add this disclaimer that these are draft model results, and they represent a hypothetical extreme surge event. And these results surprised us. I'm not going to be shy about saying that, but these results were not what we expected. And so we modeled the base 100-year storm surge event, and we got this, which was quite a lot of flooding. Then we added about a foot of sea level rise to that, and that is what the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers says would be the high projection for 2040. It's just over a foot. And we got some more flooding. And then we added the 2070 scenario, which is about 3 feet of sea level rise on top of that storm surge. We got even more flooding. And then we got way out to 2100, which is about over 5 feet of sea level rise, and it flooded basically the whole city. This surprised us, and for a number of reasons. One, this is very different from what the FIRM maps say. So the FIRM maps, the flood rate insurance maps from FEMA, which are regulatory flood maps, which delineate the floodplain. Generally, we see a lot of overlap between the HAZUS model, which is developed by FEMA, and then the FEMA FIRM maps, which are developed by FEMA. But what you can see on this map is that there's really no flood risk on most of the peninsula. All the floodplains are really on the coast. So Jason and I went on quite a research mission along with Adam and Dr. Zwick to try to figure out, well, why is it so different? We talked to FEMA, we talked to the FEMA contractors. We couldn't really get a great response from them in terms of why this is so different. So what we ended up doing was kind of pivoting to say, okay, it's going to be hard for us to develop recommendations based on this for the city. This is a very extreme event. So what we'd like to do is do a little bit more modeling, and I'll talk about that modeling in just a minute. I think Jason had a few things to say
Sure,
about.
Yeah, and so this gets into, this is just more general policy context. I know we talked with John as well about some of this when we got the modeling results, what's going on here. And I think you were actually the one that put us in touch with the FEMA contractors. So the flood insurance program, there's a lot of conversation going on about the flood insurance program, and most of the flood insurance within the United States is actually through FEMA. And one of the things that we know is that the flood insurance is in debt. About $35 billion is the latest estimate I've heard after Harvey. It's not exactly clear. Do you know the exact numbers, Thomas? No. And we have $1 trillion of exposure to coastal properties throughout the U.S. The way that I'm communicating this, and a lot of the floodplain people are communicating this, is we have to be very, very careful with firms that they're used for insurance. And it's a poor insurance program based upon the accounting of it right now. So we have to be very careful, and as I know we've had discussions, Aaron, that it's never a good idea to tell anyone who's not inside of the floodplain that they're safe from flooding. I would never do that. You should never do that. And so the firms, they're kind of the baseline. They are what's used for basically mandating that yes, if you're going to get a mortgage, you have to buy flood insurance within these areas. But it's a good idea to get flood insurance outside of the firms as well. And I think in Satellite Beach, I think most of the policies within the city are not in the special flood hazard area. Is that correct? So that tells me that a lot of people in Satellite Beach are seeing risk for flooding and are, they're actually availing themselves of the insurance. So in that way, and then we get asked as well, which one's right, HAZUS or the firms? I tend to think reality is probably somewhere in between the two. I think HAZUS is pretty extreme. The firms maybe not enough. And the firms do not account for any climate change or sea level rise, and they do not account for local stormwater conditions. And that's something that is very important to consider as well. And so FEMA will actually tell you that when we actually talk to FEMA contractors, like, yeah, we don't look at other local stormwater. So that's very important to think about in terms of flood risk. And so from that, I'm going to turn it back over to Crystal for all those caveats.
Our tag teaming. Oh, can I borrow that? Yeah. Okay, so a little bit of our lessons learned. That HAZUS is extremely risk adverse and may overestimate the flood probability exposure for Satellite Beach. That's not all bad. That's really good when you want to locate critical facilities and do evacuation planning. You want to be risk adverse, and you want to make sure you're getting people out of harm's way. You want to make sure you're locating your critical facilities out of harm's way. So it just needs to be used appropriately. The second thing we learned is modeling storm surge events with precision is difficult. The nature of coastal storms is that there's a lot of variables happening, and it's really hard to get to a precise level. So for moving forward, it's very difficult to do that. The other thing we learned, that the coastal flood model may have trouble with barrier islands, which with largely non-tidal influences. So an area like Satellite Beach, we know that most of the flooding is coming from the Banana River, Indian River Lagoon side. And I think that this particular model might have a little bit of difficulty taking that into account. And the last thing that we learned that we already knew is that the software is extremely finicky. So we spent quite a lot of time getting the software to work and getting it to work in a way to do these models. So if there's other local governments that are looking at doing this kind of thing, I wouldn't necessarily suggest HAZIS because it takes a lot of time. But we were left in this quandary, right, of we've got the firm maps on one end, which show us very low flood risk. We've got HAZIS, which shows us really extreme flood risk, but we still wanted to try to provide the city with some actionable information to move forward with their adaptation planning. So I'm going to get into that a little bit. Do you want to talk about the?
Yeah, we can talk briefly.
Just mention. Sorry.
That's it. Yeah, I know this may be kind of jumping around, but one thing that we do think with HAZIS, and I know this was something with John Stone, we worked here at Satellite Beach, that we got the request from John that we wanted to look at the fire station. And then the fire station site is actually located now in one of the lowest, one of the lowest areas of the city. And so we looked at the HAZIS results and went out to the site, kind of did some flood assessments, looked at first floor elevations, and even though the actual structure itself is not in it's not in the FEMA flood hazard area now currently, and even the new one, I think it's in front of the street, it's not in the structure.
It's like a little island around it.
Yeah, and so, but it was, using HAZIS for a fire station is very appropriate. That's one of the things that FEMA will say, that you never want your fire station to be flooded, ever. You're very risk averse. It's almost like a nuclear power plant in a sense. You just don't, like, those are your first responders. You never want there to be water in there because they're out there to save people's lives. If they're struggling with a flood, that's terrible. So, yeah, I have to say one of the highlights of my career was actually, when Irma was approaching, was going out to the city council and talking about the fire station site. And under those conditions, and I think very, very appropriately, deciding that yes, we need to move the fire station to somewhere that's higher and drier. So that's one of the outcomes from this project I'm most proud of. Just want to note that. And one more time back.
One more tag team to sort of finish this out. So we wanted to pivot a little bit away from HAZIS and try to figure out, well, how else can we estimate economic impacts of sea level rise and flooding. So we kind of went back and reassessed our goals. Okay, what can we do that's actionable for the city? So we thought, okay, instead of trying to model coastal storm surge, why don't we look at less extreme flooding events, but more certain flooding events? So we know that at high water levels, at high tides, we have nuisance flooding, sunny day flooding that's happening across a lot of coastal cities in Florida. And we know that sea level rise is going to make those those flooding events more frequent. And so we know that's for certain. So why don't we look at the economic impacts of that moving forward? So we can still, what we decided to do was model sea level rise at 3 different water levels that were referenced to the Indian River Lagoon, a mean water level, which is our average water level, a seasonal high, which happens in the fall, and then an extreme water level, which happens about once a year. But these are known water levels that are going to be happening that are going to happen on a regular basis and more frequent in the city. And we decided to shift away from looking at building impacts to looking at taxable property impacts. So why look at property impacts? Well, for most municipalities in Florida, property taxes are incredibly important. Assessed values for the properties in the city, almost $850 million in assessed value. I pulled these from the city manager's adopted budget for this year. The market value of that property is about $1.4 billion. So the revenues that are generated from ad valorem property taxes are about 58% of the general fund. It's about 39% of the total revenues for the city. That is about 6.7 million in revenues. It's about 7% more than it was the year before due to rising property values. And it's predicted that property values are going to continue to rise over the next several years. And that's good. We want property values to rise. We want the city budget to remain healthy. We know that in the future, the city is going to want to spend a little money on doing adaptation projects and protecting its community. We know that the city is serious about resilience and quality of life. So we decided, okay, let's pivot and look at how sea level rise and known flooding events are going to impact the property tax base in Satellite Beach. So we went ahead and mapped sea level rise on top of these lagoon water levels. We overlaid those with the property parcel data from the county. And then we calculated statistics at the parcel level. So for every parcel, okay, what is the minimum depth of flooding, maximum depth of flooding, mean depth of flooding? Well, what percentage of each parcel is going to be flooded at each of these scenarios? And then we tried to summarize those impacts for each of these sea level rise scenarios. So what we came up with, and I'll go into each one of these in details, a lot of these maps are going to look very similar to what you've seen before. That's not different. What's different is going to be digging into some of the impact levels. But we did 3 scenarios, about a foot of sea level rise at 2040, about 3 feet at 2070, and about 5 feet at 2100. At 2040, what we see is the flooding is minimal. You've got a lot of flooding on the western side of the city, Sanson's Island, Lansing Island, and some of the finger canals. And while the overall economic impact is low, less than 1% of the property tax base is impacted at this level because most of the flooding is along Sanson's Island, which no taxes. But while the impact is low, the stormwater analysis that Dr. Evans showed that there could be a lower drainage capacity for the whole city. So while these maps don't particularly show flooding right now, there could be more inland flooding that occurs during a high water event that also co-occurs with rainfall. So these sea level rise models are bathtub models that don't account for rainfall. At 2070, things start to change, and those are the maps that you have on your tables today. That 2070 is about 3 feet of sea level rise. We see a lot more permanent flooding occurring on the western side of the city. It's still localized to these western islands, but at the high water levels, it starts to creep inland. Some particular areas of concern are the area of South Patrick Drive, which we're going to hammer on a lot, Cassia, and then also DeSoto Parkway. A lot of critical facilities show up as impacted under this scenario. We've got the City Hall and Civic Center complex, the fire station, which luckily we're deciding to move, the ball fields, Surfside Elementary, the DeSoto Recreation Complex, and then water also starts creeping up to Public Works, Cinnamon Park Playground, and the post office. So there's quite a lot of public facilities at risk under 3 feet sea level rise. And then in terms of the impacts to the tax base, in terms of percentage, it looks low. The mean water level, which I would call the permanent flooding, is under 1% of the overall tax base, about 5 million that's impacted. At the seasonal high water level, it gets up to about 2%, which is about 17 million, and then the annual high water level, about 2.5% of the overall tax base, about 21 million. And in terms of percentages, that seems low, but what these numbers don't show you is the other half of the story, which is that when your streets are flooded, access to your neighborhoods are flooded. And so if you can't get to your neighborhood, that's going to have an impact on your property values. At 2100, things get a lot more extreme. This is 5 feet of sea level rise. This is the Corps' high projection. Again, similar to the maps that you've seen in previous studies. Much more permanent flooding along the western side of the city. At the higher seasonal water levels, almost the entire western portion of the city is flooded. More critical facilities get impacted, the police department, this community center, Holland Elementary, and the Sports and Recreation Park. And at this point, we really start to see some major impacts to the tax base. Permanent flooding impacts about 8% of the city, and then at the seasonal high water level, a quarter of the city's tax base is at risk. And at the annual high for the year, 31% of the tax base is impacted. So, some considerations just to wrap this up. At 3 feet of sea level rise, things become problematic, and you guys already know that. That's what's been adopted in your adaptation action areas, but we're trying to hit it home here. Something else for the city to consider is maintenance of property values and the tax base. Some of the numbers, the economic impact numbers at 2070 might not seem high, but the city's going to really need to think about an investment in roads and stormwater and infrastructure so that they can maintain access to properties and reduce property damages. Particular areas, South Patrick, Cassia, DeSoto Parkway. And then also to think about the indirect effects of flooding. So while your house may not be flooding, maybe 3 blocks over there's a house flooding. And what does that do to the overall property values? And thinking about what might be the thresholds for certain neighborhoods. And if a certain portion of the neighborhood might be underwater, how does that affect property values around that neighborhood? I think that's going to be really important to think about moving forward. Critical for infrastructure, I think, is an incredibly important conversation that you guys are already having with the fire station, but a lot of other facilities come up at 2070. What do you as a community want to do with those? Protect those facilities or potentially move them? And then finally, protecting the quality of life. There's a lot of recreation facilities that get impacted under these sea level rise scenarios. Sampson's Islands get impacted first. This is a community that seems very invested in their recreation opportunities, and I think protecting those is going to be important to protecting the quality of life here in Satellite Beach. So thank you. I'm going to pass it on to Thomas and Aaron. Do you have any final? Okay.
Questions now or later?
Go ahead and take one off.
Yeah. Do you want to go ahead? Yeah.
Sure.
Do you consider tax base? Roads are critical infrastructure. Roads tend to go below building base. If a road is underwater for a period of time, it'll probably damage it. Cost $1 million a plane mile to replace it. And did you, or would it be fairly simple to use the models to figure under each scenario how many miles of roads will be impacted, and then we can add that as a cost to the city that has to be dealt with. This isn't a, well, maybe we'll fix it.
Yep.
It's a, we will fix it or abandon the road.
That's an excellent next step. That's an absolutely fairly simple thing that we could do and add in, and we absolutely can do that this summer. So.
You've got the tool, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Before you start, during the next presentation, there's sticky notes on your tables. So as they talk about strategies and ideas that you like or that you have concerns or other things, go ahead and write them down because you'll be able to throw them up here. We'll take notes from that as well as other big ideas. Satellite Beach, comprehensive. So I apologize. Yeah, question.
2 questions. First one, you said by 2040 there's supposed to be a 1 foot increase in sea level rise, is that correct?
1.22. That's according to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers,
Okay,
using their high rate of sea level rise.
Okay. Second question. As we get closer to that date, and this may not be your area, but I'll fire it out there anyhow. I would guess there'll be a economical impact on land values in those areas, and it'll decrease down, I would guess. Any estimates on how that's going to play out? And I'm just thinking from a citizens wide, that kind of thing.
No, and that's a great question. I mean, from the economic impact assessment that we just did, 2040 doesn't look too bad for your area.
Okay.
It starts getting bad towards 2070.
Okay.
So 2040, I think property values are holding strong, and especially if the city over the next 20 years starts making these investments to keep roadways clear, to keep access to neighborhoods and properties open, then I think that's really going to help stabilize property values over time.
And can I just add that? In my opinion, when you see on the map, the flooding into people's homes, that's one big issue, but what you're not seeing is what's under the ground. And what we're seeing now is the pressure on the utilities that are under the ground. And so that's why you'll see us in the next from now on, up to probably 10 years, emphasizing utility. So we talk about stormwater all the time, we're talking about sewer. I mean, I don't think the day goes by that I'm not on the phone with the utility director of our county saying, hey, do you see these latest sea level rise right So those are a big issue for us. It's really under the ground that we're concentrating on now. But we're looking out, 70 years, but we still need to remember, even though you don't see the blue on the map, doesn't mean that it's not affecting us.
That's a great point, Courtney.
If I could just ask, it wasn't exactly clear, but on the coastal portion, I understand the damages caused in the mid-area, but on the actual coast itself, is there a major issue with the tax values if there's damage there?
Not under the assessments that we've done. Now, I'll make the caveat that our models, our BATSA models, said they're not taking into account coastal erosion. So between now and then, it's very likely you might have a big storm event that would destroy some of your dune systems and then allow flooding to come in through that side. But your higher elevations are along the coast, so they're largely protected. Good question.
Paul, the question about the road, South Patrick in particular, is the recommended strategy for that like earth and elevation, or how would you address that in terms of trying to?
I'm not a civil engineer. I'm a planner and technical.
For that question, the next presentation is going to be a little bit.
Strategies.
Since we went through some of these, one of the questions that came in is how will beachfront and property value change? So did we answer that one then?
Yes.
Okay. Do the maps take into account the function of the DeSoto stormwater exfiltration system, and is that why the area does not flood that much?
It does not take into account that. That's a good.
Yeah, that's right.
That's
So,
yeah.
that's right.
It's still, yeah. No, it doesn't.
So that's right. So then all these new kind of stormwater of the parks, the facilities, that all really helps to stave off the stormwater flow.
And that, just to be clear, that is somewhat of a flood attenuation project. It will help the flooding in that area, but it will not completely take care of it because there's other issues there. But that is primarily a water quality project, meaning that the purpose of it is to clean the water before it gets into the lagoon. So the amount of flood alleviation is minimal compared to the quality standards that we're putting in there.
Okay, so I'll just go through these last 2 months since they're how long would be the residence time of the water if the flooding occur? How long will it stay there in the model storm surges?
I guess I would ask Jason that question since you did the water level analysis. I guess it depends.
So for the annual high water, the way that we calculated that would basically be 24 hours. For the seasonal high water, that was about 2 weeks. And then for the mean water level, that's 183 days. Yeah. So yeah, and so it's actually a very hard system to model for the water level. So we had some data from 1996 to 2000 from Carter's Cut from NOAA, and then we also got some data from, I guess, from Florida DEP was that gauge. It's over on 192 in Melbourne, and that one actually had good data, I should say, from about July 2011 until about December of 2015, and so that's what we use for the water level analyses. The Indian River Lagoon is a strange system because it's got seasonal tides pretty much, and so it's kind of tricky. But it's actually pretty consistent. We actually looked at the Carter's Cut analysis and looking at sea level rise and what you would actually predict would happen over about 20 years with the Army Corps high projection. Pretty much matched what we found for the DEP gauge. It was almost right on the money. And so that's not to say that we're at that high projection, but it matched almost exactly. We are seeing rising waters for sure within the Indian River Lagoon. Yeah.
On hazardous can it handle coastal erosion, or is this kind of out of its ballpark?
We give it a.
Yeah, it's a. There's a different storm surge module that can be run if there's a storm that's within the system. So like Francis or Jean, I think, are in there.
John, can you restate the question? Can it handle coastal erosion is what?
It seems there were problems with HAZUS, we understand, but at least it gave values. You know, it does earthquakes and stuff like that. Does it, or, and I think I'm hearing yes, it has a module that handle coastal erosion. We may not think the values are useful.
Part of that, I think, would depend on your elevation data that you put into the model. And then, yeah, I don't know, Adam, if you have any more to add to that. The coastal erosion model is.
So supposedly, FEMA includes that in the software package. It's like the actual model that's run is a composite of 3 different models that they've created, but simplifications of those models. And so how much it incorporates erosion is.
We couldn't tailor those values.
Yeah.
Is I guess what we're saying is that it's supposed to handle it somewhat, but we can't get in there and say, what happens if coastal erosion happens at this rate? We can't get to that level of
Okay,
detail.
so in the future, if/when coastal erosion is something we really need to kind of look at, sounds like we need to search elsewhere to find something to
Yes.
deal with.
That would, yeah.
And that's actually even one of the recommendations. Is HAZUS, I mean, it's a great model, but it's a finicky black box, is what we learned. And it's great, it's used for hazard mitigation planning, FEMA recommends it, and so it's great for that, but in terms of the modeling, and Crystal and I, we are constantly on the phone about this model and how we never want to use this thing ever. Because it's really, like with your question, we know it can do erosion, but to actually try to interpret what it would mean and then what the values are, you just don't have, you can't get behind the black box to understand.
Is this a topic that maybe professionals want to look at as beginning to develop?
Yes,
Yeah.
it's starting,
Yeah.
yeah, it's
Yeah,
starting
yeah.
to come up, yes,
Yeah, yeah.
definitely.
Yeah, I'm
I
giving
know
like
we're gonna
3
do
talks,
that.
just complaining about hazards about,
So we're behind schedule.
Yeah, sorry about that.
We're gonna
Those
move
were
on.
good
There was
questions.
one more question about how will we afford infrastructure updates and upgrades? But since we're gonna talk about strategies, I'll bring that question up again during recession, unless you address it.
Fair enough, thank you. Well, my name is Thomas Rupert. I'm going to be doing a quick presentation with a colleague, Erin Dady. We're professional colleagues, just not the same. She's got her own company. I work with Florida Sea Grant through the University of Florida. Our role in this is to try to take the data that they're producing and work with the city to try to help them come up with strategy to address the impacts. However, since this modeling has turned out to be far more challenging than anticipated, they're just now starting to finish up some of the results, so we haven't yet had time to fully kind of immerse ourselves in that and work with the city yet. So what we're going to do is we're just going to give you some examples of what some other local governments are doing. And Jason's absolutely right that Satellite Beach is far out in front, but just because you're far out in front of planning doesn't mean there aren't some other interesting things that are also occurring around the state. So we'll take a look at some of those. Just a quick list. You're already doing this great data generation, and that's very useful. It's really the starting point for everything. And fire station, you've already gone over that. You're moving and getting some of your own critical facilities out of harm's way. And you are already a lot of maps looking at the future conditions. Provide notice to potential property purchasers. That's an interesting one because for me, when I look at this, when people invest and purchase property and then make further investments in that property without any understanding of what the future may hold, they're a lot more resistant to learning about those challenges after they've made significant investments. You really want people to understand what the future might bring before they make these investments. Increase elevation requirements, that refers to new construction. If you want it to be safe for a longer period of time and try to maintain some of the value, make sure you do that. And as you move forward, there are some other things that you can start looking at doing. These become more and more challenging as we go down the list. So potentially if you're allowing new development or redevelopment, potentially putting in some permit conditions there. One thing that's not being considered in many places yet is what do you do with properties that end up flooded? This has actually happened in a number of communities. I know up in a town called Nags Head, up the coast that's North Carolina, right?
Yep,
Yeah.
North Carolina.
In North Carolina, they've got houses out in the surf, and they can't even get them torn down and get rid of them. So you end up with these problems, and those are only problems that you can deal with looking far out into the future. Once it's already happened, they're stuck with it, and they're really struggling. So, and finally, of course, integrate your sea level rise into your long-term capital improvement plan. That's being done down the Keys, and Aaron will talk about that. So you're already doing this with providing information, and you've seen a lot of good maps. The data analysis really is the crucial portion. You have to do that before you can do anything else. And it's great to see Satellite Beach is doing some work that's just as good as a lot of the best states and regions that are really trying to attack this problem. I guess you already went over the fire station, so I don't need to belabor it, fortunately. But yeah, very low area right now, 2.59 feet, and then here's the new site. We've got elevations up to over 8 feet. And a lot of talk about drainage. That's definitely going to be a big issue here to address. And so I just want to give a couple of examples. This first one, anybody know what that is? It's what they call a duckbill valve. It's actually, you'll tip it up and this will go on to an outfall pipe, and it's a one-way valve so that when your outfall is lower than the water you're draining into, say the Indian River Lagoon, this will keep water from backing up into your system. So it keeps, if you have a very large pipe, like they did here, they made a very large pipe that's 6 foot. And what that does is a very long, large pipe gives you immediate storage capacity for when the rain comes down. And if you can keep the tailwater from backing up into it, it'll buy you some time right there. They can be costly to install. You have to build big vaults, and they do require maintenance. But compared to a lot of other systems, they are a good measure to take in kind of the short to medium term. And of course, you can get into actual pump systems. This is actually a pump injection for stormwater down in Key West. One of the pieces of infrastructure that we don't always think about right away is seawalls. And seawalls are particularly challenging because they can be owned by either private or public entities. If it's your infrastructure as the city of Satellite Beach, maybe you can make a decision on what to do with it. But what about when you see somebody here who's made a significant investment in a really nice seawall, and you can see the amount of good it did in this high tide event? Well, why is that? Well, because there isn't necessarily a standard that everybody's meeting for a minimum height. And that's been a very big challenge down in Southeast Florida already, and there have been different approaches as to how to address it. The city of Fort Lauderdale, when they first started looking at this problem, they said, well, we're just going to tell everybody that by X year they have to raise it to this height. And when they put that out for public comment, it wasn't pretty. So they started having meetings with residents and talking with them, and finally the residents helped the city come up with a very interesting idea. What they did is they passed an ordinance now, and this ordinance actually makes it a citable offense to allow salt water to flow across your property and flood private or public property. So when there's a high tide event and my seawall is low, and it's the low spot in the whole neighborhood, and it runs across my property and down the street and floods everybody else, I'm going to get a citation. And of course, like any other code violation, from a local government, they can actually eventually, if you don't cure the problem, they can go in and fix it and put a lien on your property for that. So it's, and yet this had a lot of support from the citizens because they worked very hard with the citizens. Just, they all know there's a problem and something had to be done. It's not that they enjoy this, but they felt this was the most targeted way they could address the problem. Because if you just say, everybody build the 8 feet by 5 years out, then you're going to be replacing seawalls. It might not be a problem. And for the next 5 years, you may continue to have problems where you don't need to. And just an example from St. Augustine where they addressed their seawall. This was a relatively common situation. And this was their old historic seawall. And of course, you can see the flooding that was resulting. And of course, the seawall has a lot of history behind it, so they didn't want to lose that history because, of course, that's the lifeblood of St. Augustine. So what they did is they actually managed to keep their old seawall, and they actually built a new seawall out waterward. But of course, I don't want to tell you how long. This was years to get this project done because it's extremely, extremely difficult to get the Department of Environmental Protection to ever allow somebody to build further out into the water than they already have. But patience is a virtue. They did a really good job with this. And that, I think, is another thing that you've got going for you in Satellite Beach that you should appreciate is that your leadership is thinking forward about these things. Because here you can see an example. This was, let's see, fall 2015. And I know Jason's used this because he likes the phrase duct tape adaptation. And here you can literally see, this is duct tape. Not holding pieces of plastic together around these barriers. This is what they put up for the high tides that fall because they knew that this road was going to flood yet again. So they put up these barriers and covered them in plastic and taped it together, and then they had about 5 different pumps that they just dropped right into the storm sewer and right out into the canal there. So this was a serious problem. They wanted to fix it now because they let it get bad before they started thinking about it. So they tried to go get some permits and get this done, and this was just, 2 years later, I think, yeah, this past fall. And now they've got some problems because, well, they didn't have all their permits. There were some sections that weren't permitted some places. They didn't quite exactly follow the permit. So there were a bunch of problems. And why? Because they were in a hurry. So these things take time. Pardon the sophisticated graphics here. This is one that is very interesting from a redevelopment or development perspective. Essentially, this is what Pinellas County has done. When you do calculations to design a stormwater system, you always have to start with your lowest point, what they call the tailwater, because you want your pipe above the tailwater. Well, this pipe was designed to be above that old tailwater level. But with just a small amount of sea level rise, as Jason had pointed out, the water is now backing up into that system. So what Pinellas County has done is they've taken their minimum tailwater elevation, and if it's tidal, what they've done is they said, well, we already had the tailwater elevation almost a foot above to account for kind of high water events. But now they raised it an extra 2 feet. 3 feet if they actually raised it an extra 3 feet if it's serving critical infrastructure. Now that's going to lead to some heartburn over there because there are properties that are developable or otherwise developable, except for the fact that they might be at 3 or 4 feet in elevation already. So how are you going to design a stormwater system where your tailwater is already supposed to be at the level of your land? Elevating buildings, another strategy. I think Aaron's going to touch on that.
Yeah.
Freeport is something that's being implemented by a lot of local governments across Florida for multiple reasons. Some of them because they want to adopt higher than code regulations to participate in FEMA programs, some of them just because it makes good sense. But essentially what you're doing is requiring your development to start at a higher base floor elevation. And freeboard ordinances have been shown to account for themselves in terms of the investment that you make over time. This is a great chart. I got it off of DEO's website, by the way. I didn't attribute it to them, so I'm doing that verbally now. But for every foot of freeboard that you go, the savings over time increases. So it's one of those demonstrable methods that you can do to make like a code change. The development community has typically pushed back a lot of time on freeboard ordinances when being adopted, so a lot of public education with your development community. This is something that would be applied for new construction, or if there's a substantial renovation where more than 50% of the property value is being renovated over time, you would build to this higher standard. Oh, wrong way. I gotta figure out the right way to go. Okay. Challenges with freeboard. We've talked about some of these challenges with Courtney and Rochelle and others, that sometimes when you have significant or really what I would call popular height ordinances in a community where you don't want, you know, giant buildings everywhere and you cap a height at like 35 or 40 feet, a freeboard ordinance could be a constraint. So there have been local governments that have accommodated that by saying for every foot that you require elevation will allow you to go beyond that height ordinance, but not in some unlimited fashion, because we still want to preserve the character of the community. So Key West recently went through this effort where they changed their charter and said, you can elevate up to 4 feet and we'll give you a foot beyond that height ordinance per foot that you're going to elevate. So it still kind of capped it, but it wanted to remove that constraint of people that want to actually elevate their properties for flood insurance. Many communities, I found a great website, again, I think it was through FEMA, that listed out all the Florida communities that have adopted freeboard ordinances. And it started with requiring 3 feet, then 2 feet, then 1 feet. Of course, when you get to the 1 foot, that's the easiest to adopt with the least amount of pushback. So a lot of local governments have adopted a 1 foot standard. But more and more local governments are using this as a tool. And it's a great way. It's something that others are doing, so it's not something that's weird or novel. Broward County has adopted a new series of groundwater maps. Courtney has talked about some of the groundwater implications. So what Broward County has done is they've done a map series where they've looked all the way out to, I think it's 2069, looked at precipitation models and groundwater impacts from saltwater intrusion, from sea level rise, and they've said, you know what, from now on, you're going to have to show in your development project how you're going to meet those future conditions with what we know that the groundwater is going to be. So what that means is you have to design your swales, your stormwater management systems to account for those future groundwater impacts. This is the first local government in Florida that we've heard of actually doing this. Not the first one to necessarily say you have to factor sea level rise into your development decisions, but one that has said, you know, we're going to require your stormwater management systems to fit that future conditions. This is kind of what it looks like, the map of what they have throughout the county. So it took some work. They work with USGS and I think even the Corps of Engineers to determine what those groundwater elevations are going to be. But then they adopted this map series into their code. They adopted the regulations into their code saying, this is how we are now going to manage our permits throughout the county. Other Broward County actions, I mean, they're part of a regional compact for dealing with climate resilience. They have their own climate action plan. And the reason I put this up here is so you can see a comparison to what Satellite Beach has done. You're in line with what other local governments are doing, and that's an important thing. Right now, as Thomas mentioned, the City of Fort Lauderdale has adopted a sea level rise ordinance. Broward County is in partnership with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and they are doing a seawall analysis throughout the entire county and figuring out where those low points are
to potentially start focusing some of their outreach and education efforts, so you don't have one guy that's raising his seawall and the guy next door that's not raising his seawall, and essentially obviating the need for the guy who raised their seawall in the first place. So they've developed this partnership with the Corps of Engineers to figure out where those choke points are county-wide for all of their seawalls. I would anticipate that they would adopt something similar to what the city of Fort Lauderdale is doing, but they decided that they wanted to study the extent of the problem before they adopted a regulation to actually require something. Now, this goes to Mr. Fergus's question. What do we do about roads? And here's a case study in Monroe County. What they did was they decided to do a pilot project after they had 2 neighborhoods that were significantly impacted by king tide flooding in 2015. First, it was in 2015, and we could predict from the NOAA tide gauge what we thought that the tidal impacts were going to be. The problem was that they had an extreme wind that occurred on top of the designated king tide week, and instead of it being, I think it was like 8 inches of what was predicted, it ended up being about 15 inches in certain neighborhoods, and it persisted because that wind persisted, so there was no way for the tide water to ever go down. So you explain to the community, this is kind of a weird condition, that we saw. We knew the tide was going to be bad, but we had this wind, and we don't anticipate that this condition is going to happen a lot. Well, in 2016, the exact same condition happened again. And it happened in other neighborhoods, so I don't want to say that it really made us liars, but it definitely kept that issue of the king tide seasonal flooding on people's radar screens. So what the county did was they said, look, we're not going to try to fix every road at one time because we don't have enough information to do it. But what would elevation look like? I think there was another question of what design do you do? What road-based materials do you use? How do you tackle this problem? So Monroe County said, we're going to do a pilot project in 2 neighborhoods, very, very different neighborhoods, and figure out what road design looks like. So one of the goals was actually to incorporate a certain level of sea level rise into road design and develop a policy approach, look at cost benefits, that type of thing. And here's kind of a schematic, and I find certain areas in the Keys to be very reflective of some of your areas here and some of your conditions here, where certain low areas, where's the pointer? Which one's the pointer?
It's the very bottom.
Oh, okay. These low areas in red, these were the lowest areas that were essentially acting as conduits for the tide water, for the king tide water. So it would come down here, and it would come up this orange area, and what we learned through this project was you don't have to raise the whole neighborhood to a certain level. But if you fix some of these conduit areas to a certain area, you really fix the extent of the neighborhood flooding throughout the entire area. So your investment doesn't have to be miles and miles of roads. Identify what the main problems are and fix those main problems first. This was in Big Pine, so the idea was to focus on those areas in red, and orange because they were of the lowest elevation. This community, the reason we picked this community being in Big Pine is it has heightened water quality standards, it's got weird habitat issues because of it being a national marine sanctuary, and we figured if we can get permits to do elevation here, we can do it anywhere in the community because this is one of the hardest places to get your permits, so we don't have to, like Tom pointed out with St. Augustine, spend 10 years in the permitting process. We want to know that if we're going to be able to elevate a road, we're actually going to be able to get the permits to do that. So the initial results, this is where it kind of gets funky. With each elevation, a higher road is a wider road, and a higher road means you have to pave more of the road, which means it's more expensive. And many of the roads there are just on muck, and they're uneven, and they don't have stormwater systems in them. So when you're going back in, you're bringing those roads up to current conditions, so you're elevating more length of the road, the higher you want to go, and you're having to put stormwater systems in because you're dumping into a national marine sanctuary, which here again you have heightened water quality standards. You could be faced with similar issues. So in terms of eliminating a scenario or designing to a scenario where we would not exceed 7 days of flooding per year, and that we would design this road to handle 2040 sea level rise, because a road has about a 25-year shelf life. This is what we were looking at in the two communities. We were looking at 6 inches in the Big Pine neighborhood, and we were looking at 12 inches in the Big Pine neighborhood. We were looking at 6 inches in the Key Largo neighborhood, which is reflective of the topography and the height in the two communities. So again, you see, a higher road, you've got to pave more. You go from 0.25 to 0.35. It increases the cost of what you have to do because more length means more storm water and all of that other stuff associated with it. So ultimately, you can't factor in everything, but we had some design assumptions associated with that. And here was the other thing. The county was not ready at this stage of the game to start condemning right-of-way and start taking people's property. So the idea is, where is that sweet spot where we can provide some level of flood relief, still accommodate future sea level rise, still accommodate all the water quality requirements, but not start taking people's property away. And this was the sweet spot, the 6 inches and the 12 inches. So, along with that, the county developed a process. And they have ultimately adopted this design criteria. So now you have another suggestion on roads. Figure out what your design criteria is for future flood risk and adopt that into your code. First thing is figure out what level of sea level rise you want to protect to. The county chose median, low, median, high projection. They chose median because this was their first project out of the box. And the idea was if they can get the stormwater in, if they can get the road base rebuilt, then it becomes a paving issue over time. And if their assumption is conservative and sea level rise is more progressive than what we originally thought, it's okay. You don't have to go back in and rip out that design. You've at least designed the road to accommodate some level of future flood risk. So then, on top of it, how long do you not want your road to flood? How long do you want to keep people's feet dry? 30 days seemed like something that, quite frankly, from an engineering standpoint, was too hard and too long to guarantee. And 1 day was kind of ridiculous if you tell people, we're going to keep your feet dry, only let you flood 1 day. So we picked 7 days, a not to exceed standard of 7 days per year. We looked at the local conditions within that particular neighborhood to make sure that we could accommodate sea level rise and not flood more than 7 days per year. And then we made a decision. Can that road design meet that criteria or not? If yes, you're good. If no, you gotta figure out if you specially designate that road and you say, hey, there's only a certain level of risk that the county is gonna be able to afford. Because at some point, Crystal had talked about at some point, when the impacts are so significant, you have to look at what can the local government actually do to accommodate that future flood risk over time and what is cost effective to do it. And then again, if you can't meet that particular criteria, how do you provide for some level of meaningful access? And what does meaningful access mean? Does it mean a 4-wheel drive? What does it mean for properties? And there's some cases out there that kind of drive that decision. So this is the process. At this point, what the county did in terms of looking at local factors, they were able to meet that design criteria with these 2 pilot projects. And ultimately what they did in a resolution is they adopted that design criteria. Just the not to exceed 7 days of flooding, figure out how long the road's going to be in service, and adopt to a sea level rise scenario and elevate to that level. And I'm happy to say that the county just put out the bid last week to bring in engineers to actually design those 2 projects. And the people that live in those 2 neighborhoods are very, very happy right now. Very, very excited to get those projects done. The last thing I'm going to talk about is Fortified Building Standards. Fortified is a code that's been promoted by the Insurance Institute for Building Safety, and essentially it is an above code standard. Has anybody heard of LEED? Like environmental design and development? This code supplement is essentially dealing with flood and wind risk. So it's essentially designing to something that's higher than what the Florida Building Code may require. Insurance Institute for Building Safety, I tell people these are the guys that build houses in big wind tunnels and put the turbines on them and figure out when the shingles are gonna fly off. You know, that's what they do. They figure out what is the breaking point for certain buildings. They have worked to design this fortified standard. The Urban Land Institute has done studies saying if you construct to this standard, you're increasing your home value by up to 7%, which is a good thing. And the cost of compliance on new homes is obviously smaller than if you go back in and retrofit. So it's an economic decision, but the most valuable thing that the Insurance Institute for Building Safety has produced is what they call a code supplement. And basically what that does is it says, here is how you would take this standard and draft it into local government building code language, and that you could potentially adopt it. And you may need to do a technical deviation from the Florida Building Code, but the benefits outweigh the costs, so it's something to consider. Many states are adopting this standard, like Oklahoma adopted this standard for tornado resilience. Alabama has, the Carolinas have. So it's just another thing to consider. You know, stick a toe in the water, maybe you incentivize instead of requiring construction to this. We'll give you expedited building permits or waive them or fees, that type of thing if you want to build to this standard. So again, that's, you know, kind of a who's who of what other local governments are doing on this stuff. Some of these things have been brought up before, I think, in some of the other public workshops. And we just wanted to put a finer point on who's doing this across the state of Florida. So that's all we have for presentations. Mr. Fergus.
Bad news first, I guess. I read an article that Miami Beach has had a problem. They raised a road, and the insurer for one of the businesses, I think it was a restaurant next to the road, denied them a claim because it was a basement. It was below the level of the road. And these are some interesting legal or whatever you want to call it, issues that are going to come up when folks start raising roads. Just that it's out there, these unintended consequences.
Tom and I are very aware of that. Miami Beach, when they went through their road elevation project, they went like this. 2060, 24 inches, that looks good. I'm not suggesting that approach for elevating roads. That's what I would call the go big or go home strategy. Monroe County, to me, is probably a more pragmatic model in terms of figuring out what level of sea level rise do you want to design to? How long is that road system going to be in service? Designing to a 2060 standard, you're going to be through 2 road cycles at that point in terms of paving, milling, infrastructure reinforcement, that type of thing. Why not look, you know, for the useful life of that potential road facility? So possibly taking an incremental approach might have served Miami Beach a little bit better, but you know, politically, I don't do any work in Miami Beach, so I can't, you know, advise them. And at the time, Miami Beach has put a lot of big projects in motion at one point, and that is their adaptation strategy.
I guess the reason I brought it up is that I don't think, and I would have never thought that, well, you raise a road, you've done something good, and then an insurer comes in and says, oh, you really messed it up for some, it's unintended. The other is a good thing, probably John can speak to it better, is we had a new roof put on 2 houses. And John said, you know, if they do it according to code, it meets a lot of business for wind mitigation. And obviously, the insurance companies aren't advertising that real strongly. And to make a long story short, we paid the pittance to have somebody come and do the certification and save 50% on insurance. And that's something, you know, John did. In other words, that was the Florida building code. You didn't have to do anything extra, it's there already. And so that's a message as far as wind mitigation that can go out to anybody.
I would tend to agree with that, there have been numerous studies that have been done post-Irma that showed what the newer building codes have done in terms of the difference of damage versus what we would call maybe like pre-Andrew kind of codes, when we really kind of changed the approach throughout the state. So I would agree with you. The only suggestion on Fortified is it deals with wind and flood at the same time. And so perhaps an approach is to incentivize construction to that standard initially as a pilot to see where it gets you. But yes, we do have pretty good, when you rank Florida's building code in terms of wind and flood resilience to other states, Florida's in a very high percentile.
Okay, I have some questions, and then this is Courtney. We're gonna do our role playing, so I'll go through the questions real quick. Yeah, I don't think we're gonna have the time for the role play, but that's up for you to ask what they wanna do.
Well,
We
we
have 5
can, I
minutes.
just don't know if we have enough people.
Yeah.
But what it would be good though is if the people who are not staff, don't do this every day, go ahead and take a packet with you so you can see the strategies that are on there and you can see some of the things that we're faced with. You know, like the difference between, when you're looking at, it's like the beach renourishment project that we have, we do emergency projects and things like that. And a lot of people think, you know, it's a waste of money because the sand goes away and we have to do it again in like 3 or 5 years. Well, the alternative to that is buying the property or letting seawalls come in. So buying the property is very expensive and we don't have a funding source for that. We have a cap in the millage that we can get to by state statute, and we don't have enough room between what we currently charge and the cap. If we went up to 10% millage, we still wouldn't have enough money to buy even 2 properties along the ocean front. So you see what I'm saying? So there's those considerations. So and we don't pay locally for beach renourishment. It's the tourist development tax that's the local match for that, but it's state and federal money that pays for beach renourishment. So what we were asking for an alternative, and we need really state money for that. So those are some of the challenges that we face, it's always money. Money's always a challenge. But also it's, I think Thomas will tell you very, when you're looking at asking people to move, it's really hard to do. It's very hard to do. There's an emotional attachment to the place and to the home itself. And so telling people, like I see on Facebook a lot, we should just let the buildings fall in the ocean. Well, that's not, really, in the real world, that's not really feasible. And it's also, people live there. A lot of people that live on the ocean save their whole lives to move there. So that's their retirement. And so that's their whole life, it's their investment. So telling them that it's gonna fall in the ocean or, things like that is not really a feasible thing for government to really do, So those are some of the things that we have to face. And then we have, go ahead. And then, just utilities, in this county, and I think you can say everywhere in the state of Florida, we went through years and years and years of, I'm going to blame it on the baby boomers, because I'm just going to do it. Baby boomers didn't want to pay taxes. and so we kept our taxes really, really low for that, and we're paying for it now. We're paying for that now. So we're seeing big, increases that are going to happen across the state to pay for the utility problems that we're having in the
state of Florida. So, it's, you know, it's a lot of infrastructure issues, decisions between relocating and preserving and keeping people in the same place. You know, issues of when do you start abandoning roads. Those are all things that we have to consider. And then if you're looking at retreat policies, you have to look at how that's going to impact your economy in your city. If you look at the oceanfront, that area East A1A is 4% of our land area and 22% of our tax base. And that's even with us owning 40% of our oceanfront property. So if you look at Indian Harbor Beach, imagine how much that's of their tax base, because that's all developed over there, you know? So when you take that off the table, and they have the same erosion issues that we have. I don't know why Solid Beach is always the one in the news, but they have the same exact erosion issues that we have. So their buildings are as close to the dunes as ours. But you know, their tax base, that impact is a whole lot worse for them because they depend on that more than we do. So those are all issues that you have to consider, and then the loss of population and what that means to your local businesses. Go to Papa Gallows and ask the owner how much the season, is what they call it, means to their business and what that would mean to them if they lost it, and see if they can stay open. And I can guarantee you they'll tell you no. So those are the issues that we have to consider.
Good, so Courtney laid out a whole bunch of things for you guys to think about. So, yes, take home the packet. We're gonna go through the questions, so you guys can answer more questions. We still have 15 minutes left. And like I said, as we're going through the questions, as you guys are looking through the packets, write down ideas, write down adaptation strategies that they talk about, that you want the city community to think about. And I'll leave the Mentimeter open until tomorrow when I get to work. So if you write down that code and you start going through the packet and thinking about it tonight, you guys can go on to the next slide and write down adaptation strategies that you like. And then I'll close it tomorrow. Okay, so Courtney kind of already answered the how will we afford infrastructure upgrades. That's something we really got to think about. Does Satellite Beach have building code height restrictions against freeboard?
Yeah, building heights.
Building height code restrictions against freeboard. Does Satellite Beach have that?
So that's another issue. We have what we have in our
City is a charter provision that requires us to go to the voters if we change our zoning, any of our zoning code that raises the height limit or the density. And so that is becoming challenging for us because we have a commercial building in our community that wants to do mixed use and put residential on top. So they now have a 2-story building. When they want to, a lot of them, not a lot, but some of them have wanted to pull their building up, on the second, to basically raise the building so they can put stormwater and parking underneath the building. And they can't do that because they run into that 35-foot height limit. So what we're finding is business owners, once they see all the challenges with tearing the building down and redoing it, which we don't have any really vacant land here, and most of you know that. So most of our land is all redevelopment. In fact, all of our land is redevelopment. Every piece of property on in this area has been developed at one point since, dawn of time. So when they come in to redevelop and tear the building down, they realize all these challenges, so they don't do that. So they just renovate the building. And that might be great for the people who only care about the character of the town. The problem with that is they're not complying with stormwater regulations. They're not complying, so when we don't keep water on site and we contribute to the stormwater system and the water draining into the lagoon, you're number one, hurting the lagoon, and number two, you're contributing to the flooding problem. So we're not alleviating any of the flooding in the city by not promoting redevelopment. So that's one of the challenges we're talking about right now, is actually bringing a ballot initiative to the voters to do that, to raise the height limit. And the other issue is, we're also looking at population loss at some point in the world, the time is that along the river. Now, obviously, and a lot of people think like, well, if we do it now, everybody's going to redevelop, and then, we're going to have all these people here. And the fact is that nobody redevelops all at once. So there's no market here for that. You might have that in Boca Raton or something like that, but you don't have that here. we don't have that market, we don't have that interest. People can't even, they won't even raise their buildings. So we don't have that level of investment here. It will take years for any of these ideas to move on, into fruition. So if we change the zoning code, you may not even see a new building for 4 or 5 years. But what you do is you prepare for that, and you make, that incentive there, and you keep it going. The other issue too is if you don't promote stormwater on site, we end up having to pay for that because we have to do it at some point. So we end up having to buy the property. The taxpayers, we'll end up doing that, and we'll have to, we don't have a lot of vacant land, as you know, and we'll have to condemn property and knock it down and build on it, and that's very cost prohibitive. It's very expensive, and we don't get money for that. Grants. We get grants to build stormwater systems. We don't get grants for acquiring property and tearing it down. So that's on us. So those are things that we have to consider in the long run.
So I'll follow that up with, what role do stilted houses play in the future of city development?
I think you're going to see people doing that automatically at some point when they realize that it's a good investment. Just like we don't really need to move the fire station today, but we need to put a second floor on. And we don't want to put a second floor on a building and then move it 20 years later, because you want your buildings to last 100 years. So if you tell a resident, hey, you're in a flood zone, you may have about 30 years before you really see water, storm surge running through your building. Would you put yours on stilts now, or would you wait 30 years and then spend $150,000 raising it? So they're going to do it when they build their houses, once they realize that.
So what role do you see living shorelines and native landscape swales and other buffer zones versus seawalls in the short and long term?
Well, right now we're doing it all, Nick.
I just wanted to have it out there. I was more for them. I was wanting to see their perspective.
Okay.
I know what we think.
That's becoming more and more prevalent, depending on the areas that you live in. Like, we're seeing some of that going on even in urbanized Palm Beach County has a couple of living shoreline projects to protect their Lake Worth lagoons. So I think that school of thought about how the natural system fits into the adaptation equation, I think that's becoming more and more prevalent.
I guess this was more of a comment. Firm does not account for sea level rise or other variables, as well as areas that have no BFE or X zones. Is that a comment? Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I can probably elaborate that. The individual cities and the counties were required here a couple years ago to adopt the state's model floodplain ordinance. Within that ordinance, which became all the cities' floodplain ordinance, within that is where freeboard is addressed. As an option, you can adopt some level of freeboard, 1, 2, 3, or 4 feet. The problem is that ordinance only applies to special flood hazard areas. So I think, the problem is that FIRM map is a very conservative map, and so now we're only talking about freeboard in these areas according to this very conservative map, where we really need to go back and look at freeboard again on a citywide perspective, where, because a lot of cases you don't have an established base flood elevation, so you can't really use the BFE as that baseline, which generally that's what the baseline is for freeboard. It's above that at that point. So you may have to look at some elevation, sea level, or something like that, and try to address it more comprehensively citywide, as opposed to the way it currently is throughout the state, and that's through the model floodplain ordinance.
A great point.
That's a great point.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great point.
And actually, I think, Aaron, if you know more about this, correct me if I'm wrong, but I know that what's up?
I can still hear you, sir.
You can still hear me. Miami Beach actually had BFE that varied around the island. And finally, what they just said is they said, look, we're just going to set BFE uniform across the whole island at a minimum of 8 feet for our purposes, for our regulatory purposes. So that's what they did. So now, if you're building there, you're gonna have to go above that foot.
Good.
But just to touch on that, I write flood insurance and specifically condominiums on the beach side. And what you're seeing is that model is, it's not really becoming apparent yet, but it's becoming less cost effective for retirees simply because of the driving costs. I don't know if anyone's seen the preliminary flood maps that are coming out for the county, but the V line is actually pulling back in Cocoa Beach. A lot of the clientele I have that are in the V zone now are getting pushed out of it into the X zone. And as you said, there's a lack of consciousness or development because of their out of the special flood.
Right.
And for the properties that are being used as investments, the banks only care if they see an A or a B. There is no other consideration, meaning those properties, the third map there, whenever those flood, those mortgages don't have to have a policy.
Correct.
And cost-wise, I mean, the investment, if you're in an X zone and get the preferred risk, you get full coverage if it's your primary home for like $450. And, you know, on the coast, if you're not grandfathered, you're looking at $20,000 a year, depending on the building itself. I have a client that was grandfathered, dropped their flood because they're all retirees and they don't want to pay for it, lost their zoning, and when I had to re-quote it for them, it was $250,000 a year. Because it's in Cape Canaveral and it was built in the 50s, it was built to withstand a nuclear bomb, they didn't expect us to come. You know, and so, you know, that kind of stuff is, and
that's on the beach?
Yeah, that's direct ocean front. Similar to Sandcastle, how it juts out into the beach there. Not to harp too much, I mean, I went to a conference in Miami right after a flood, and we talked about the same thing. And the private model is basically going to, there's a lot of talk about it, but the federal government runs up too many debts, and people and private companies are not going to take on those risks, especially as we've all talked about.
Right.
You know, even the most advanced cities are unfortunately decades behind what's coming, and so they're aware of it. The private companies, Lloyd's of London, CoreLogic, they're all aware of what's coming, and you know that's going to affect how investment properties are going to be.
Because if they actually, if the maps reflected reality and the coming reality, you know, I think you'd see a lot greater participation in flood insurance itself, which would drive down the cost for everyone. You know, I mean, I don't live in a flood zone, but I have flood insurance, and that's just because I'm a planner. But none of my neighbors do, because I mean, some of my neighbors were told by their banks they didn't need it.
Right.
And as she said, if this area was an A zone, people would be forced into it. They would then mitigate against that cost, and then they would drive up their own property value. So it is. I mean, I know this is a federal problem, not a local problem, but it is. It's a extra tax money.
Yeah, it is a local.
I mean, it's a federal solution, that's what you're saying, right? You know, and when we go to Washington every year, and one of the conversations we had was with Rubio's office about our flood maps, and his office asked me to send it to him, because they are like, you know, we're getting a lot of complaints about this, and they just rolled out another bill.
Yep.
For funding, right?
For updating, getting
your-
more accurate elevation information in the maps.
So they're listening a little bit, you know, so they're understanding there's an issue, especially for, you know, legislators from Miami, you know. But that's, you know, it is in their realm. You know, when you talk to legislators in Oklahoma, they don't have a problem.
Any other questions? Oh, look at that, 2 minutes early and it's a public meeting.
Right, well, thank you guys for